glitches, but I think we're all hooked in and we can proceed. And I guess I should apologize in advance if I pressed the wrong button, because I think this is the first time that I've actually ever done this, and we lose the slides. Amy's still here to help us out, but I apologize in advance if something goes wrong. The title of our session is Advocacy and CRA Rules, and the phrase CRA rules, as I was thinking about the title, occurred to me that the phrase CRA rules may be a bit misleading, in the sense that you're not going to come away from this session with a kind of handy set of rules that you can check, or a recipe or a formula that you can check to determine whether you're on or offside in terms of what's permitted in terms of political activities for registered charities. Rather, my hope is that at the end of the session you will have an understanding of certain basic principles that then you can apply to your own particular situations. My own view is that probably in about 95% of the cases you don't need to consult a lawyer. You can simply, as long as you are conscious of the principles and aware that you have to ask questions, you can figure out what's permitted and not permitted and whether you're onside or offside. There may be some instances where it is important to consult with your lawyer to determine whether a proposed course of action is permitted to your organization. Your organization is permitted to undertake it. So that's by way of introduction. If we go then to the first slide. Yes, the first slide. So the guiding principle. And I just want to take a moment and read this extract from the Canada Revenue Agency's policy statement on political activities, because if there's only one thing that you take away from our session this morning, just please remember this principle. And I'm just going to read this. Through their dedicated delivery of essential programs, many charities have acquired a wealth of knowledge about how government policies affect people's lives. Charities are well placed to study, assess, and comment on those government policies. Canadians benefit from the efforts of charities and the practical, innovative ways they use to resolve complex issues relating to delivering social services. Beyond service delivery, their expertise is also a vital source of information for governments to guide their policy decisions. It is therefore essential that charities continue to offer their direct knowledge of social issues to public policy debates. I'd just like to repeat that last sentence. It is therefore essential that charities continue to offer their direct knowledge of social issues to public policy debates. The principle, or the takeaway here, is that charities do have a role, and the regulator, in other words the Canada Revenue Agency, acknowledges on behalf of government, and this is a policy statement of CRA, that charities do have an important role in public policy debates. So my sense, based on my practice, and our firm acts for a fair number of registered charities. My sense is that a lot of charities censor themselves. They don't engage in the public policy debates because they think that they can't engage in political activities, and that is not the case. It's embedded in the law, as we'll see in a moment, and I think it's amply reflected in this extract from CRA's policy statement on political activities. So please remember this so that you're not kind of tucking in your elbows when a policy issue comes up for your organization. So what are we going to do this morning? This is an overview of where we're going to go. And we're going to start off by looking at a couple of what I call first principles, looking at the meaning of charitable purposes and activities and charitable activities. Then we'll look at certain rules under the Income Tax Act as they pertain to political activities. Then we'll look at permitted political activities, prohibited political activities, and what I called here charitable activities, or another way to characterize these would be activities that at first blush may seem to be political, but CRA has deemed or considered them and said so that it will consider them to be charitable activities. Then we'll do kind of a summary in the form of take a look at a decision tree, and then there's after that we'll take some questions, and you've got some resources at the end. The sections dealing with permitted political activities, prohibited political activities, and charitable activities will essentially be straight out of the CRA's policy statement on political activities, the extract from which I read a moment ago. And that is a very, very useful guide, and I would encourage anyone, all of you actually, to download it from the CRA website and to read it and keep it handy. So, first principles, charitable purposes and charitable activities. I want to focus for a moment, first of all, on this idea of charitable purposes. And I'm assuming that all of you who are participating are either staff or board members of organizations. And I can't stress this enough, and you'll see why in a moment. It's very important for you, for your organizations, for the board of directors, for senior management of the organization, indeed all staff of your respective organizations, to familiarize yourself with your charitable purposes. You may ask, where would we look to find out what our charitable purposes are, the charitable purposes of our respective organizations? And here you would look at you're not going to look at your mission statement or the latest strategic plan. What you have to do is look at the letters patent. In other words, the document that created the corporation, the corporate entity that is your organization. All organizations, and well, here I'm making a bit of an assumption, but I will assume that all of your organizations are incorporated. There are other forms of organization, but I'm assuming that all of your organizations are incorporated. And they were incorporated by what are called letters patent under the new not-for-profit legislation, either federally or provincially. They'll now be called articles of incorporation, but I suspect that all of your organizations were incorporated by letters patent. And the letters patent spell out the objects, the goals, the ends of your organization. It'll say the corporation is incorporated to do or for the following purposes or for the following objects, and it'll list them. It'll list the object might be to assist refugee claimants, to provide services to people who are poor. If your organization, or if an organization is an educational organization, then its purpose or object will be an educational purpose or object. There is a definition of charitable purpose in the Income Tax Act, and I'll come to that in a moment. But what constitutes a charitable purpose or charitable object has really been defined by the courts down through the centuries. And the courts have settled upon 4 categories or 4 classifications of charitable purposes. The first of which is the relief of poverty. So an organization set up to I don't know, run a soup kitchen, to provide food for people who are poor, that would fall under the heading of relief of poverty. The second classification or category is the advancement of education, so schools, educational charities that do educational work. That is a recognized charitable purpose. The third recognized charitable purpose is the advancement excuse me, of religion, so churches and retreat centers and so forth. And then there's a kind of a fourth category, which is a kind of a basket that includes any other purpose that the courts have recognized to be charitable, and which doesn't fall under the first three. So it isn't the relief of poverty, the advancement of education, or the advancement of religion. And that fourth category is called other purposes beneficial to the community. And it includes things like the advancement of health, the protection of the environment. Probably in the case of a lot of your organizations, purposes related to the support for immigrants and refugees, that would fall within the fourth head. In addition, the Income Tax Act has a definition of what is a charitable purpose. And it says that a charitable purpose, and it's not an exhaustive definition. In other words, it doesn't say, charitable purpose means the following. It just says that a charitable purpose includes the disbursement of funds to a qualified donee, so a qualified donee includes other registered charities. But then it goes on to say, and we're going to come back to this in a little while, because this is one of the changes that occurred in the budget of 2012. So it says, other than a gift, the making of which is a political activity. So in other words, the definition of charitable purpose in the Income Tax Act says, okay, if you're a registered charity and you make a gift to another registered charity, that is considered a charitable purpose. But if the purpose of the gift is to advance a political activity, then that is not a charitable purpose. So, as I said, we will come back to that, if you will, that exception or that exclusion from the definition of charitable purpose in a moment. Charitable activities. Charitable activities are not defined either by the courts, nor are they defined in the Income Tax Act. I think the best way to think about charitable activities is to think of your programs, your charitable programs. If you're set up to provide counseling to, if the object or the purpose of your organization is to support new immigrants, and one of your activities is to provide employment counseling or English as a second language, that is a charitable activity that aids or supports or furthers the purpose for which your organization is set up, namely to provide support to new immigrants. So the charitable activities, as I said, is not defined in the Income Tax Act, but it is a feature that, or a phrase that features very prominently in the definition of a charitable organization, which we'll come to in a moment, which is defined in the Income Tax Act. And we will see also in a few minutes how this phrase, charitable activities, plays a role in what is permitted and not permitted in terms of political activities under the Income Tax Act. So to summarize then, I'm dwelling on this idea of charitable purposes because that's the framework for your organization. That the objects or the purposes set out in the letters patent, or if you're incorporated under Articles of Incorporation, in your Articles of Incorporation, really set out the scope of permitted activities for your organization, and as we'll see in a moment, also have a bearing on whether a proposed political activity will be permitted to your organization or not. And I'll explain that in a moment. charitable organization. This is under the Income Tax Act. You've got the general category of registered charities, and then under that you've got a number of subcategories. There are two main subcategories. One is charitable organization and one is charitable foundation. And then under the heading of, or category of, charitable foundation, you've got private foundations and public foundations. For the purposes of our discussion this morning, I'm not going to talk about foundations. I'm assuming that all of your organizations fall within the category or classification of being a charitable organization. And essentially a charitable organization, again in kind of simple terms, is a charity that actually engages in charitable activities, delivers charitable programs to clients and the beneficiaries. The definition in the Income Tax Act of charitable organization, it goes something like this, and this is, I'm just going to read the relevant portions of the definition and have a bearing on our discussion of what is a permitted political activity. The legislation says that, actually there's some other, yeah. So this is subsection 149.11 of the Income Tax Act. It says a charitable organization means an organization, whether or not incorporated, so we're going to assume that everyone's incorporated, whether or not incorporated, all the resources of which are devoted to charitable activities carried on by the organization itself. So the key thing to remember there is that according to the definition of what a charitable organization is under the Income Tax Act, all of the organization's resources, so that's the human resources, cash, your lease premises, your equipment, everything, your volunteers, all of those resources have to be devoted to charitable activities. The significance of this definition is that in order for an organization that is a registered charity and that is a charitable organization, classified as a charitable organization, in order for that organization or that charity to maintain its status as a registered charity under the Income Tax Act, it has to continue to satisfy that qualification. In other words, it has to devote all of its resources to charitable activities. That is a qualification for not only becoming a charitable organization, but also for remaining a charitable organization. And I've certainly we've had clients where CRA has come in and done an audit and determined that not all of the charities charities' resources have been devoted to charitable activities. In some cases, that results in CRA deregistering the charitable organization, and in some cases, CRA simply says, "Look, you're not following the requirements of the legislation. You need to do so. So clean up your act." So with that background, so again, just to summarize again, that background, we have charitable purposes in your letters patent, so it does define the scope of what a charitable organization is permitted to do. The requirement that a charitable organization must devote all of its resources to charitable activities. Let's take a look now at the rules under the Income Tax Act that specifically apply to political activities. And some of you may have heard of what's called the 10% rule. There's actually, that phrase is not used in the Income Tax Act. But the Income Tax Act does allow for an exception to the requirement that a charity must devote all of its resources to charitable activities. And I'm just going to read the provision in the Income Tax Act that allows for that. And the assumption is that if it's a political activity, it's not a charitable activity. And that, I mean, and that's consistent with what the courts have said, that if charity is engaged in an activity that is a political activity, then that is not a charitable activity. Assuming that, therefore, how do we get around the requirement that a charitable organization has to devote all of its resources to charitable activities? If by definition a charitable activity is not a political activity, or conversely, a political activity is not a charitable activity, then how do we get around that requirement? And the Income Tax Act actually provides the answer, and this is in this is the 10% rule. And the 10% rule reads as follows: for the purposes of the definition charitable organization, so that's the definition we looked at a moment ago in subsection 149.11, where an organization devotes substantially all of its resources, so again, sort of key in on the word resources, so it devotes substantially all of its resources to charitable activities. Again, recall the definition, all resources devoted to charitable activities. Well, this says where an organization devotes substantially all of its resources to charitable activities carried on by it, that is carried on by the organization, and number one, it devotes part of its resources to political activities. Number two, those political activities are ancillary and incidental to its charitable activities, and we'll come back to that in a moment. And three, those political activities do not include the direct or indirect support of or opposition to any political party or candidate for public office. Then the organization, so the charitable organization, shall be considered to be devoting that part of its resources to charitable activities carried on by it. In other words, this provision of the Act says if a charitable organization is devoting substantially all of its resources to its charitable programming, and it applies or uses some of its resources to political activities, then the part of the resources devoted to political activities will be considered a charitable activity. Essentially, that's what that says. Now, the question is, well, what does substantially all mean, and what does part mean? And here, the Income Tax Act does not actually specify the 10%. The Canada Revenue Agency has taken the position, it's sort of an administrative position, and publicly so, that the expression substantially all means 90% or more of the resources of the charity are devoted to charitable activities. And therefore, if a charity that is devoting part of its resources to political activities, if the resources devoted to political activities do not exceed 10% of its overall resources, then that will be permitted. So that's the 10% rule. Basically, if you look at the 10% of the resources, if your organization is not devoting more than 10% of its resources to political activities, then you will fall within the provisions of this section of the Income Tax Act, and you will effectively be operating on side in terms of engaging in political activities. Of course, there are two other qualifications, and we'll again come back to that these in a moment. Number one is the activities have to be related to your charitable activity, or essentially your charitable purposes. In other words, if you're an immigration organization and your purpose is to support immigrants and you engage in political activities designed to reverse the federal government's position on the Northern Gateway Pipeline, then it's unlikely that there's a link between that political activity with respect to the Northern Gateway Pipeline and the purpose or purposes for which your organization, as let's say a settlement organization, is set up to accomplish. So that would not be considered a permitted political activity for your organization to the extent that you're a settlement organization and you're engaging in political activity related to the environment. So it's got to be related to what you're set up to do, and it has to be incidental. In other words, it can't take on such significance that effectively you're going to exceed the 10%. And obviously, your political activities cannot involve either support for or opposition to a political party or a candidate for public office. So that, again, is built into this provision of the legislation. The 10% rule, there are exceptions to the 10% rule, and these have to do with smaller organizations. CRA recognizes that the 10% rule may not apply in the case of an organization that whose income is on the lower side. So you've got these exceptions that are, and these exceptions are set out in the CRA's policy statement on political activities. And so if your annual income is less than $50,000, then you can spend up to 20% of your resources on political activities. If it's between 50 and 100,000, you're looking at 15%, and if it's more than 100 and less than 200, then you're looking at about 12%. So there is some flexibility in terms of how CRA will apply the rule. The final rule I just want to draw your attention to, this is one of the things that was introduced by the government last year in the budget, and that has to do with making gifts to other registered charities for political activities. Until this amendment to the Income Tax Act a year ago, a registered charity that made a gift to another registered charity, even if the gift was for the purpose of funding the recipient charity's political activities, the charity making the gift would not have to account for that expenditure as a political expenditure, but rather it could account for it as a charitable expenditure. Under the rules, registered charities can make gifts to other registered charities, and that's considered a charitable activity. And so what the government did was it introduced a new definition in the Income Tax Act, and I'm just going to read it to you. Political activity includes, so it doesn't, again, this is not exhaustive, but it includes the making of a gift to a qualified donee, so that includes registered charities, if it can reasonably be considered that a purpose of the gift is to support the political activities of the qualified donee. So if Charity A makes a gift and intends to support the political activities of Charity B, then that gift, that expenditure, can no longer be accounted for as a charitable expenditure, but has to be accounted for by Charity A in its T3010 filing as a political expenditure. And obviously, the Charity B will also account for its expenditure of the gift on its political activities as a political expenditure. So obviously the intention of this new definition was to tighten things up to prevent charities from essentially funding each other's political activities. It's permitted, so it is a permitted activity. It's just that now a charity will have to account for those expenditures as a political expenditure and not as a charitable expenditure. So, permitted political activities. And here I'm really just taking all of this from CRA's policy statement on political activities. So this is something that you can look at, read at your leisure. on the one hand, these are considered to be political activities. So CRA takes the position that these activities are political activities, but they're permitted. So they fall within the 10% rule. You can engage in them, but you have to make sure that you're not devoting more than 10% of your resources overall in a year to any one or any combination of these activities. So the first is a public call to political action. So if you orchestrate or organize a letter writing campaign to the government about a particular issue that you're working on, then that is a political activity. If you organize or are involved with other organizations in organizing a march on the legislature at Queen's Park or on Parliament Hill, then that's a political political activity. If you take out a full-page ad in a local newspaper calling on people to write their members of Parliament about an issue you're working on, that's a political activity. That's it is permitted, but it is a political activity. If you publicly call for a change to, or you oppose a law or government policy, that also is considered a political activity. Or if the government is considering changing its policy or changing a law, and you publicly call for the retention of the policy or the retention of the law in the context of the government actually considering a change, then that too would be considered a political activity. So again, an example, a full-page ad in a local paper opposing a proposed law or changing government policy would be considered a political activity. Permitted, but nonetheless it's a political activity. The third type of political activity, I think, is really designed to capture activities of an organization that may not be public. So if internally you have people working on a campaign that will call for publicly for the public to contact their members of Parliament, the members of provincial Parliament, or publicly call for a change to a particular government policy or law. The preparatory work of even if that's sort of behind the scenes work that is never made public, that is also considered to be political activity, to the extent that the intention of the work is to bring pressure to bear on politicians or public officials. So if you've got some research, you're doing some research on a particular campaign, which will ultimately end in a full-page ad in the Globe and Mail calling for opposition or opposing a particular government policy or law, then the activity of the researcher, to the extent that it's related to what ultimately will be a public call opposing a particular government law, that activity of the researcher will be caught by this particular provision, and you'll have to account for his or her time and the resources related to the work of that person as part of the political of your organization's political activities. What can't you do? A couple of things. One is a charity that is formed for a political purpose cannot, or that's probably a bad way of phrasing it. An organization that's formed for a political purpose cannot be charitable. So that's long-held position of the courts. If your organization is set up to achieve some sort of political purpose, and the courts have recognized as a political purpose things like opposing or supporting particular political parties, or opposing or supporting changes to government policy or legislation. If that really is your raison d'etre, your purpose, the purpose of your organization, then you cannot consider yourself to be a charity. In addition, as we saw earlier, when we were looking at the exception to the rule that a charitable organization has to devote all of its resources to charitable activities, we saw that one of the permitted political activities, it wasn't permitted. But one of the requirements was that the political activity cannot include the direct or indirect support of or opposition to any political party or candidate for a public office. And so partisan, what I've termed here as partisan political activities, if your organization is engaged in, as an example, if it's in the context of, let's say, of an election, and your organization comes out and publicly supports the policy of one of the parties, then likely CRA would consider that to be a partisan political activity, even if the policy espoused by the political party coincides with policies that you've been advocating. So you've got, so the sort of the general rule is whether it's direct support or indirect support of either a candidate for office or opposition to a candidate for office or a political party, that is not permitted. I'm going the wrong way. Okay. This, I think, is an area that a lot of registered charities are confused about, and this has to do with engaging in activities that involve public policy debate, and doing so publicly, and thinking that that engagement is a political activity. And so they tend, at times, at least in my experience, they tend to shy away from that, thinking that they can't do that. Again, I recommend to you that you read CRA's policy statement on political activities. One of the things that it says there, and again, I think that this is consistent with the case law, is that fostering public awareness about your organization's work or an issue that your organization is working on, so a public information campaign, and not only is it permitted, but CRA does not consider it to be political, but rather charitable. So they wouldn't necessarily say it's educational, but they recognize that charities do have a role in bringing to the attention of the public issues that the charity is working on, and so fostering that awareness among the public without necessarily calling for a change in legislation or government policy, but simply presenting the issues in a fairly well-reasoned way, that would be considered by CRA as a charitable activity. Similarly, if your organization sets up a meeting with members of provincial parliament, members of parliament, officials, let's say at Canada Immigration, to talk about a particular public policy issue or a change to the law that your organization thinks is needed, that communication, that meeting, the work to prepare for that meeting, all of that would be considered a charitable activity. Again, with the proviso or the qualification that what you're talking about has to be related to the purposes of your organization. So again, coming back to the first principles that we started with, you need to know what the objects are for your organization. You need to be confident that the issues that you're working on, whether it's in a public awareness campaign or in communicating with elected or public officials, that it is somehow related to and in furtherance of the purposes, the objects for which your organization is set up. So that's a pretty fundamental question that you need to ask yourself before embarking on any of these activities. But I think that the other important thing to remember, though, is that you can consider these types of activities as charitable activities and not political activities. And so you're not, for example, constrained by the 10% rule. And finally, and again, this is taken from CRA's public policy position on political activities. If you, let's say, were to have a meeting with a government official, or you made a presentation before a parliamentary committee holding hearings on a proposed change to the law, you could release your presentation, your representation to government officials to the public. And even if the representation included a call for a change in the law, as long as you didn't draw attention to that, that release of the representation would be considered a charitable activity. So you've got some flexibility, and if you look at the history of the history of the case law, so there was some early case law back in the 1980s, and even earlier government positions on this. The view was that any sort of communication to the public to try and persuade public opinion on a particular issue, that would be considered political. So there's the policy statement issued by a CRA back in 2003, the one that this is drawn from, did represent an opening up and an expansion of what the CRA considers a permitted political activities, and also formerly may have been considered political activities are now considered to be charitable activities. This is a summary, and I hope you can read it. This is a bit of a decision tree, and I think it does kind of summarize where we've been, and so I just want to walk you through it. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, and the first question you need to ask if you're about to embark in some sort of either campaign or activity is, does the activity further the mission or the purpose of the charity? So that's your first question, and that comes back to our first principles. And if the answer is no, then essentially you've got to stop there. That's not, you really are straying outside of what is permitted, and I wouldn't recommend that you proceed any further. If, on the other hand, the answer to that question is yes, then the next question obviously is, does the activity involve either directly or indirectly supporting or opposing a particular political party, politician, or candidate from public office, for political office or public office? Again, if the answer is yes, then you've got to put the brakes on and stop right there, and not proceed any further. And that will really, I think if you're caught doing that, then you could really get into trouble, and so it's something that you really need to take a look at. If, on the other hand, the answer is no, then we go down to the various possibilities. So does the activity involve any one or more of the following? So this is on the farthest left-hand side. You're looking at it, the farthest left-hand side of the screen. So does it involve a call to the public to engage in political action? Does it communicate to the public that a law needs to be changed, or does it communicate to the public opposition to government policy or law? And are any of the internal documents of the organization, do they express the intention to encourage people to engage in political action or to oppose government policy or government law? And if the answer to any of those questions is yes, then you're engaging in political activity, but it is permitted political activity, and then you're subject to the 10% rule. Does the activity, so the next box over, does the activity involve providing a financial gift to another registered charity so that that other charity may engage in a political activity? And again, if the answer is yes, then you need to account for that expenditure as an expenditure on a political activity. It's not, as it was before the change to the income tax last year, it's not considered a charitable activity. The next box over, does the activity involve communicating to the public on a particular social or other issue that is related to the work of the charity? And if it is, then that's considered a charitable activity. Similarly, does the activity, the next box over, involve making any representations to public officials or elected officials? And if so, then the activity is considered a charitable activity, even if in the course of those meetings or that representation you're advocating for a change or the abolition of the policy or the law. And then again, does the activity, finally, the final on the farthest right, does the activity involve the release to the public of the submission of the representation to the government? And again, if you're not specifically drawing attention to or encouraging with the release of the representation of the submission, if you're not specifically encouraging people to engage in political action or to contact their member of parliament, then such a release of the representation of the submission, as long, and the other qualification is that the entire document needs to be released. You can't just select bits and pieces. So if you release the whole thing, then that will be considered a charitable activity. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. Just before we get to the questions, if you look at slide 14, I've got a list of resources that you might find helpful. Generally, the Canada Revenue Agency website is very useful. So I would encourage you to take a look at it. The top resource, so the resources for charities about political activities, that's a relatively new posting by CRA, and it's an attempt by CRA following the changes to the legislation a year ago, an attempt to try and summarize in one place on its website some guidance for registered charities on political activities. And they address a variety of things, including how to fill out the T3010 form, because there have been changes to that. What are the sanctions if you're offside? What are the potential penalties and so forth? So that's useful to take a look at. CPS 022, the policy statement, again, that's I've drawn on that quite heavily in for this presentation, and so I'd encourage everyone to take a look at that. Some interesting comments on the guidance around upholding human rights and charitable registration. I suspect that a number of the organizations whose representatives are participating in this will be interested in that. And then again, there's a policy statement on assisting ethnocultural communities, which again I think would be relevant to your organizations. So I've got one question here. What about a research report that has recommendations about government policy? Is this a political activity? This is going to sound like a lawyer's answer, but it depends on the research. But if it's a critique of the government policy and it's a well researched critique, then I don't think that would be considered political activity. If, on the other hand, it included recommendations that for the change to the policy, and it was published, and the organization actually drew attention to those recommendations, as I suspect most of the release of such a research document would actually highlight the recommendations, then in that case it would be considered a political activity. But if it's just an analysis of government policy, and it's a policy that affects an issue that your organization is working on, it's of concern to your organization, then I would not consider that to be a political activity, but a charitable activity. I mean, remember what CRA defines as a permitted political activity: a call to political action, a public call for a change in policy or law, or internal activities that actually are intended to call for either political action or a change in public policy or law. Any practical tips on how to easily keep track of political activities for reporting purposes? No. Well, you know, you need to, I think what you need to do is, as you're going along, set up mechanisms for tracking these, just as you presumably have set up, your organization has set up mechanisms for tracking expenses related to fundraising. Now that we've, CRA is now kind of zeroing in on fundraising expenses, and they published a guidance and republished actually recently guidance on fundraising expenses. So you just need to track these, and as I said at the outset, I don't think this is going to give you a recipe or a formula, but it will give you principles. And so when you're thinking about your programs for the coming year and doing your budgeting and your program planning, be clear about identifying what you think is political. Obviously, an easy expenditure to track is if you make a gift, your organization makes a gift to another registered charity, and the purpose or the intention is to fund the political activities of the other registered charity, then obviously that's a bit of a no-brainer. The Act is very clear on that. The difficulty is that the word resources, so coming back then to the provision in the legislation, the word resources is not defined, and it's not an accounting term. I think if you were to ask your auditors what resources means from an accounting point of view, they would kind of look at you blankly. It's not an accounting term. So you're going to have to set up, you're going to have to look at things like cash expenditures, people's time, quite frankly, I'm a bit at a loss in how you would value the time of volunteers. So if people are coming in and volunteering to stuff envelopes to send petitions off to members of Parliament, I mean, I'm not sure how you would quantify that, but that's something that you probably should be talking with your accountant about to get some guidance from the accountant. And so there's another question on the allowance for permitted political activity. Sounds very specific. That is 10%, 12%. How is this measured? Do they look at this in terms of yearly staff and financial activities? They look at it in terms of all of the resources that are deployed by a registered charity in the course of a year. So it is over a period of time. So in that respect, you're correct. You're looking at it over the time period of a year, but it's 10% of the resources. So as I just finished saying, that unfortunately that term is not clearly defined in the it's not defined at all in the legislation. If you look at CRA's guidance on or policy statement on political activities, it will talk about human resources, financial resources, property, volunteers. So the sort of the panoply of resources that a charity employs in the course of its activities. I suspect, and here I don't have any evidence, so I'll take this for what it's worth, that a lot of charities, to the extent that they even report this, do it in terms of expenditures. You know, they'll just take it'll be a sort of a rough and ready percentage of their overall expenditures. But lost may be an accounting for the involvement of volunteers on a political campaign. You know, they may not have occurred to them, and as I said earlier, it may be a little difficult to quantify that.
So that's it for the written questions.
Okay.
I have a verbal question.
Oh, sure.
Okay, so I'm asking this question actually on behalf of someone who couldn't participate in this webinar. So in the case of individual client advocacy, so let's say someone is working on a client case and finds out there's an issue that has policy implications, doesn't get anywhere with the civil servants who make decisions, writes a letter to the Member of Parliament on behalf of the client, flagging this concern and asking for two things. One is an exception in the case of this particular client, and second, for policy change. Would that be political activity?
No, it wouldn't, and for two reasons. One, the advocating on behalf of a specific client would not be considered political activity. That would be considered a part of the charitable activity. And then number two is the letter is a communication to an elected official, and so again, that would be considered the letter to the elected official, to the Member of Parliament calling for the policy change. I mean, remember what we were saying earlier: communications with public and elected officials, even if the communication involves a call for a change in policy or law, that's considered charitable by CRA.
Okay, thank you. Another question.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say there's an organization that's organizing a public meeting, which is a political activity because it's calling for systemic change, it's doing advocacy in this setting. So I'm working at an organization that's going to promote this event to my clients. Would that be considered political activity?
Well, it would depend. I mean, it would depend on the nature of the public event. If the public event is simply an awareness raising event, at which there's actually not a public call for, it's not a public demonstration, and there's no public call for a change in policy or government, then the answer is no. And I think even if at the public event there was, and one of the purposes was to not only have the event so that people could talk about whatever the issue is and formulate, let's say, policy recommendations and publicly call for it. So arguably, that in that situation, the event itself would be considered a political activity on the part of the organization that's hosting and organizing the event. I don't think that letting people know that such an event is taking place and encouraging them to go would necessarily be, you're not calling for expressly calling for a political action. You're simply saying that there's an event at which these issues are going to be discussed. There may or may not be some public policy recommendations arising out of the event. But I wouldn't see that necessarily as triggering or or involving a political activity on the part of the organization that's actually promoting the event.
Okay. Okay, and my last question. So you've given us some excellent resources on these slides where people can look for more information. So if we have questions beyond this, is there a source, a contact person at CRA where we could ask directly, is this, does this qualify as political activity if you have other questions for clarification?
Yeah, you can call, certainly you can call the Canada Revenue Agency, and they've got a 1-800 number, and I just can't remember what it is off the top of my head. Essentially, though, what you'll get is someone who answers the phone and can answer certain questions. But if you have a more difficult question, or a question that kind of is skirting around the edges of this policy and the law as it applies to your particular organization, likely what they'll do is they'll refer the question on to a more senior person at CRA. And they can be helpful. I mean, there are some people there who are helpful, they're knowledgeable, and they will try and assist you. But remember two things. One is CRA is first and foremost the regulator of charities. The Canada Revenue Agency is not like, for example, the Charities Commission in the UK, which has been set up as an arm's length agency intended to educate and support charities. CRA is, they're the enforcer of the tax, the Income Tax Act, and they're the regulator. That's number one. Number two is CRA is, unless you get it in writing, CRA is not bound by, and even if you get let's say a policy determination, you write a request to CRA, you kind of lay out the scenario, and you say, give us a written opinion on this matter. They're not necessarily, the policy of the law could change, and in the future, they are required to apply the policy or apply the law as it exists in the future. So you're not necessarily, in terms of what you propose to them, you would be safe. In other words, they couldn't, on the one hand, give you their blessing for engaging in a certain activity and then come back in and then criticize you. But on the other hand, it wouldn't necessarily bind them for the future. So unless you get it in writing, something oral from, even if it's a more senior person, is not going to be binding. And so you've got to be a little careful in terms of relying on what CRA tells you. But you can phone them, and my experience is on phoning on behalf of clients is that they are kind of eager, maybe too strong a word, but they are prepared to help and answer questions. And if the person you get at the other end of the line doesn't know the answer, then they'll refer it on to someone more senior.
Right. All right. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you.
Do you have any more questions, participants? Okay, seeing none. So we'd like to bring this webinar to a conclusion. Thank you, Ted, for your presentation. Very illuminating. And I'm sure people will have more questions at the face-to-face session next week.
Okay.
And thank you, everyone, for participating in this session.